Well, hello. This is Wade Frazier. This is April 14th, 2026, 12:13 p.m. This post is one of a series that I'll make. We'll see how many it takes. I don't know, but it might take a while. And I'll intersperse it with other things probably. But this is my first post on what I call the medical racket. And so this one is going to be more of an introduction overview to the subject. And I've been writing about the medical record since the 1990s. I began studying in 1990, actually, and Ralph Hovnanian's Medical Dark Ages was a milestone for me in understanding what a racket it was. But it goes back to age 12 for me, which I'll get to a little bit. Um, at its root, Western medicine is a racket, largely because men dominate it. That's really what it comes down to. It's a conflict of paradigms, and so the vast majority of medical care over the human journey was administered by women on family members. And in mythology of ancient Greece, um, it made clear that feminine medicine, so Hygeia and Panacea, who are these Greek goddesses of medicine, they focused on nutrition, sanitation, hygiene, and their treatments would be gentle treatments, sort of like herbs. And so this was essentially feminine medicine, feminine medicine. And in fact, the staff of modern medicine, the AMA, I think, it's got a snake around it and a serpent. And this is back before Book of Genesis, etc. The serpent was associated with women. They shed their skin, regeneration of life, this kind of thing. And so the snake in that iconography is related to women. And masculine medicine, which dominates Western medicine today, is a form of warfare. And it's almost that simple. So one is about gentle prevention and gentle treatments. The other one is warfare. And so this is the paradigm split that we've had for millennia. And in our greed-based ideology of capitalism, which dominates the world economy today, Western medicine is capitalist-based, and so above all considerations, this is about making profits. And if Western medicine kills millions of people with its treatments, it's irrelevant. Doesn't matter. All that matters is profits. And a lot of people just have a hard time believing that, but it's true. And so, yeah, the casualties of the Western medical paradigm, millions and millions and millions of shortened lives. And but the Western medical mythology thrives to this day. And treatments that kill people are hailed as miracle treatments. Anyway, and I'll briefly survey this in this post. Yeah, as unbelievable as that might seem, it's the reality, and it's not unique by any means. So this is how the rackets operate, the global rations that control the world economy. And my work, as my readers know, I go back to beginning. I go back to beginnings of the universe, beginnings of Earth, life on Earth, and the journey of life on Earth, and the human journey, and my work really goes deep on those subjects. And life on Earth's never been easy. There've been some brief golden ages for some special species, and then some humans in the early days of exploiting new energy source. There were these brief-lived golden ages, but it was never easy. So until the Industrial Revolution, half of all children died, and a trend that goes all the way back to gorillas. And so it was never easy. And then the diseases that kill most people in industrialized societies today are degenerative, circulatory diseases, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, all this kind of stuff. And these are all degenerative diseases, and they were largely unknown before the rise of civilization. In fact, they have been called the diseases of civilization. And before civilization, so back in the hunter-gatherer days, before there was farming, infectious diseases were rare. Again, humans were scattered across the planet. So it wasn't until humans began living close together in cities, then crowding and filth led to epidemics. And so, yes, that was one of the handmade as a companion of the early civilization was epidemic diseases. Again, another disease of civilization, let's say. They had these big epidemics. And the rise of civilization led to the rise of professions. In fact, that's often considered the chief outcome. And the first professional medicine was affirmed in the fourth civilization. So a sumer there, the cuneiform tablets that have survived. There was a lot of medical writings back in the first writings. The first writings were significantly about medical practice. But with the rise of civilization, women's status declined universally. So wherever civilizations arose, women's status declined, and they became the broodmares of agrarian economies, and men kind of owned them, and so men dominated many early professions. But by the time of Hippocrates, back there again, the ancient classic Greeks, doing no harm was part of the Hippocratic Oath. But that idea has largely been discarded in favor of the warfare model of masculine medicine. And so Western medicine, and I get this a lot where I talk about medical racket, and people go, wait a minute, what about emergency rooms and this kind of stuff? Well, Western medicine is good at emergency medicine. It was developed on battlefields, back to the warfare model. So emergency medicine was basically developed on battlefields, and reconstructive surgeries they're also good at that, which also comes from battlefield injury, taking care of battlefield injuries. That's where that stuff had its root. But it's a miserable failure for almost everything else, especially degenerative and infectious diseases, which is what kills, again, degenerative diseases kill, again, the vast majority of Westerners today. And infectious diseases really don't, but infectious and degenerative disease treatment, they're both rackets today. And again, I write about the 7 rackets that control the world economy. And those 7 rackets, everybody in those rackets drinks the Kool-Aid of their indoctrination and conditioning. And they rarely learn any differently. They don't want to. So at the end, imbibing the Kool-Aid, et cetera, gives them in-group status and employment and all this kind of stuff. And so people are very resistant. In fact, most people, they drink this Kool-Aid while young, and they die drinking the same Kool-Aid. They never change. They will hold on to those beliefs for the rest of their life. In fact, they would rather die than give up those beliefs, which may be hard to believe, but I watched it happen a number of times before I began to understand what I was seeing. And this is, again, it was common with all rackets. So I kind of don't want to pick on the medical racket too much because all the rackets operate similarly. The sociology is all similar. In fact, Ed Herman invented these constructs to explain how the media operated, which is one of the 7 rackets. And he came up with the bloodbath framework, the propaganda model, and the media's disparity in treatment of worthy and unworthy victims. And Ed's co-author of those works where he invented those ideas was Noam Chomsky. And Noam observed that people who fail to drink the Kool-Aid of their indoctrination and conditioning, which begins when we're when we're small children. Noam said that right around kindergarten, the people who think independently and aren't guzzling the Kool-Aid, they tend to be weeded out of the system. And so by the time a child grows up to be the age, gets out of college and become a journalist, for instance, they have totally, again, they're thoroughly indoctrinated and conditioned. And so as they become a journalist, for instance, again, since the independent thinkers were weeded out, these journalists will faithfully and slavishly adhere to the mainstream assumptions, such as American imperial benevolence and the wonders of capitalism. And I'm referring specifically to the American media. In general, works for the West, but specifically the American media operates this way. And so journalists, in fact, Noam would say that journalists would, when Noam and Ed would expose the media's lying, basically all the distortions of the media, journalists would say, "Nobody tells me what to write," and Noam replied, "They don't have to. So if you believe differently, you wouldn't have your job." And so anyway, this is again a very again, this is the structural view of how these things operate. Yeah, almost everybody involved is just again they're following perverse incentives in a world of scarcity and fear. They only care about their jobs and they drink that Kool-Aid and they're good for life. This is a human universal. These things are human universals. It goes back to in groups, out groups, and social and societies competing against each other and survival. This is the root of all that. Social animals. This has deep roots in the human journey. And in fact, Noam argued that back to what I just said, Noam argued that the propaganda model is just a special case. In fact, the propaganda model is a conflict of interest model, which shows that the ideal of the media, right, of challenging power and informing the electorate gets subverted to service lead interests. And so the propaganda model filters, ownership and advertising and the news sources, and then flack when anybody falls outside the approved paradigm, and then back then, and then ideology, which when Manufacturing Consent was written in 1988, it was anti-communism, which is an American religion. And so these filters ensured that elite interests would be served by the media and the public would be brainwashed instead of informed. So, and then Noam argued that the propaganda model is really just a special case of the constraints that all intellectuals in capitalist societies are subjected to. In fact, Noam took it further, and he went back to the Old Testament and the prophets, and basically criticizing elites and calling out elite crimes has always been hazardous for one's health. And so, yeah, Noam's point is that, again, back to diseases of civilization, these dynamics are as old as civilization. And and so for me, it goes back to this, and I write about many times, is that the 1% conspiracy and 99% complicity. And so, the humanity readily falls in line with the herding. And that humanity, again, the 99% complicity is real, but so is the 1% conspiracy. So the shepherd knows what he's doing. Okay, so there's in fact, I'll get to in a minute. Noam does this. It's sort of like there's no conspiracy here. It's just how businesses operate, et cetera. And it's like, well, my companies survived organized suppression. Corporate hitmen were sicked on us, et cetera. And so they know how to attend to their interests. And this goes back to Adam Smith, right? And wiping out the competition is the essence of capitalism. So it isn't just all structural and conscious. There are people definitely who are concocting this stuff. And again, and it works. So it's like, and again, he said 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. And we can all do something about the complicity, which is what I'm more focused on than the conspiratorial end of that. For the herd size, the shepherd's task is surprisingly easy. Yeah, humanity herds itself. This is what I learned during my journey, long before I ever encountered Ed, Noam, scholars, and medical racket writings and stuff. I already experienced these things firsthand. I revealed the identity, actually, one of the corporate hitmen who was sicked on us, Bill Delp. And so, so what I found is that when like the organized suppression we were subjected to, at least 90% of it was what's called structural, which is just people doing their jobs in a system with perverse incentives. Yeah, so prosecutors who don't care if their targets are innocent or not, and they'll lie as much as possible to get their conviction, which they admitted to us. So that's how the system operates. Or the federal court ruling on the lawsuit that my partner Dennis waged against these gangster officials. And the official ruling was, well, they're a gangster. It doesn't matter if they're gangsters or not. Yeah, prosecutorial immunity and statute of limitations. It doesn't matter if they're murderers. It doesn't matter because they're immune. So again, the system just churns out this stuff. It's just like the slippery slope to corruption, and it's everywhere. So I said I don't want to pick too much on the medical racket. It's just another example of this, of how this works. But The medical racket kills millions of people. So that's, there's some serious consequences to this. Just as the energy racket is starting to make Earth uninhabitable. Oh yeah, there are real consequences to all this racketeering, and the herd just following along and being so easily herded to their doom. These are things I learned on my journey. Yes, people refuse to be responsible for their lives, and they play victims instead of being creators. And creators create with love. In a world of scarcity and fear, operating through love is the toughest feat on earth. That's the hardest feat on earth to accomplish is to operate from a place of love in a world of scarcity and fear. That's our challenge as we're in creator school. So to focus more on medicine, so when my family changed his diet from processed food to whole food in 1970, when I was 12 years old, it was to save my father's health. His health was unraveling. He was only 33 years old. He's heading for a heart attack and worse. And then when it was a booklet we got a hold of that inspired that change, which was about, and it was scientific research that showed that processed food, again, back to the diseases of civilization. So processed food was what caused hardening of the arteries, and whole food was the cure, whole fresh food. And so anyway, and so we did. Our family changed from processed food to whole food, and my father had a health miracle over the next 2 years. He reversed all of his health problems, became the healthiest he ever was. But that book was actually banned in the United States in the next decade for being contrary to informed medical opinion of the day. And it turned out that that book's advice was totally right. Medical opinion was totally wrong. And in fact, that book's advice forms the first line of defense in mainstream medicine today. Yeah, so it was formerly banned, is now the frontline defense of mainstream medicine. I'm actually surprised I live to see that. And I'd love to see some other those kind of victories for the truth and stuff, for health, etc. There's a few more, but it's always been an uphill slog. But by the time I became an adult, early adult, it's my early 20s, let's say, I strongly suspected that the same dynamics that led to heart disease was common to all degenerative diseases. And I felt that was the case. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. These are all. I strongly believe that, suspected that they all had the same root cause. And it wasn't until 5 years ago that I actually read the scientific explanation for that. And yes, there was one root cause, and it's called metabolic disease. And actually, since I read it, I read stuff on metabolic disease all the time. And so this is increasingly being seen as the root of our degenerative diseases, which again comes from mostly the processed food we eat. Yeah, like 60% of American calories today come from what they call ultra processed food. Not processed, super processed. We're so far removed from the original food, whatever the original life form was, is unrecognizable, like a graham cracker, let's say. And in fact, in this years since then, I've seen more explanations of what's happening. And it turns out it dovetails with other studies I've been doing. And what it is that the electron transport chain in your mitochondria, which drives the enzyme that makes ATP, and ATP, which is the coin of all life on Earth, of energy of all life on Earth, it basically feeds the electrons into the chain too quickly, and then the chain clogs up and it overflows and creates free radicals, and it leads to the death of cells. And in fact, they also changed over to less efficient ways of getting their energy. So that, again, that breaks. So the whole electron transport chain thing breaks eventually, which leads to aging and early death. Free radicals, aging, and early death. And so Alzheimer's is just an organ failure of the brain, diabetes, and failure of the pancreas, hardening the arteries, all this stuff. And so it has the same basic cause, which comes down to, again, processed food, which is, again, a product of civilization. And so, and in fact, the mainstream treatments for circulatory disease, even today. So, and it's amazing that, over 10 years ago, I saw that, eating whole food and, diet and lifestyle changes are supposed to be the first line of defense. Well, The medical racket still sells plenty of bypass surgeries and statins and this stuff. And even by their own rigged studies, they're worthless. They do not extend the life expectancy at all. Yeah, so all the studies have been, even the orthodox studies have been done on bypass surgery and statin treatments, is that they're totally worthless if extending the life expectancy of the patient meant it worked. Yeah, so they're totally, but they make trillions of dollars. All these kind of things make trillions of dollars for the medical racket. Yeah. So in fact, orthodox cancer treatment is the same thing. They all attack the tumor. Slowly they're getting away from attack the tumor, but it's still, that's 98% of what happens is attack the tumor. Well, attack the tumor does nothing to address the metabolic disease. You're attacking a symptom, not the cause. And so, yeah, so medical interventions are worthless for degenerative diseases. But that's where the big money is. So there's huge money in these treatments that are worthless. Yeah, so managing symptoms is not treating the disease. In fact, treating the disease will, you no longer have a customer because you have a healthy person. So there's a perverse incentive there to do that. In fact, big food is vertically integrated with big pharma. So that crappy food and people eat it, well, it's endless line of customers for big pharma. A steady stream of customers for the medical racket who die agonizing deaths at the hands of Western medicine. Yeah, this is what we got. And so, when I first wrote my medical racket essay, I was focused on degenerative diseases, especially cancer. But I also just studied the origins of infectious disease theory, which Louis Pasteur is largely credited with. And I studied this quite a bit. And Pasteur was a scoundrel and who sought money and fame, and his germ theory disease, this ballyhoo germ theory disease, seems to be a plagiarism of a contemporary, Antoine Béchamp. And the official history of Pasteur's career, and again, there's been, revisionist works written that show that his image is like a fairy tale. And just like the mass murdering thieves, George Washington and Christopher Columbus were mass murdering thieves, and they're these American heroes and fathers of my country. Same stuff, so this heroifying of these mass murdering thieves and scoundrels. This is part of how it works. And so, yeah. And so, Pasteur didn't invent vaccination. Jenner is considered the first vaccinator, but it's never worked. And Pasteur was the first great commercializer. But there is no evidence, there's no credible evidence whatsoever that any vaccine ever conquered a disease. There's no evidence for this. And this is back to the propaganda. It's all this barrage of propaganda, but there's no evidence that it did. So improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and hygiene is what ended infectious diseases in the West, not medical interventions. And yeah, so they all went away. All these diseases virtually vanished before there were any medical interventions for them, particularly vaccines and antibiotics. Yeah, the diseases were pretty much gone. The deaths were over by the time these vaccines were introduced and these antibiotics were introduced, which is, how to say it, the medical racket will not tell you this. That's not, again, all the vaccine promoters and stuff, they avoid this like the plague, but the facts are there. In fact, the official facts are there. And so, but it's sort of like going on, don't look at the man behind the curtain. So there's this whole thing where this is this illusion that's conjured that vaccines are these miracle medical interventions or preventives. They're not. In fact, there's strong evidence that vaccines have shortened many millions of lives. And one of the things, and over my years of study, I've seen this a lot, is that Western biomedical science, and this goes back to actually Béchamp and his successors like Rife and Yasson and the Sounds. There are subcellular dynamics that are ignored today in mainstream biomedicine, which points to different paradigms of how things operate. And in fact, one of the things that's become very clear to me is that Western biomedical science has a very poor understanding of immunity and health. Very poor understanding of that. And it's partly because the whole field's so corrupt. So even the defenders of biomedical science admit that the flimsiest and most corrupt branch of science is biomedical science. and primarily because it's riddled with conflicts of interest, because the people funding biomedical research are trying to profit from it. Right there, you have a conflict of interest that invalidates everything. And so biomedical science is mostly worthless because it's all undertaken with trying to create a big financial windfall from selling some new drug or medical procedure. This is so this is why. And so capitalism and medicine make very poor bedfellows. And this is, again, it should be obvious. Yeah, that's where I went to business school. I was steeped in all that stuff and the miracle of capitalism and stuff. And if those cheerleaders knew the cost of capitalism. And again, and Western medicine is just one example of many of the cost of having greed-based economic systems. Yeah, they're gonna serve some interest at the expense of everybody else. And that's expected, normal, right? And so, in fact, right now I'm currently reading Aaron Suri's Vaccines, Amen, which I'll report on one day at length. And I'll some short pieces from it right now. And again, Suri's an attorney, and he's been involved in many lawsuits around vaccines, and so and legal proceedings. So this isn't this isn't some rumor or opinion or whatever. Suri's evidence is depositions from the leading figures in vaccinology and this stuff, and what's became evident in Suri's work and stuff. Again, there's no good evidence vaccines are safe, and even their effectiveness is largely propaganda. It's not really based on any evidence. And last year, actually, in fact, right after Robert Kennedy Jr. took over the medical bureaucracy, there was a measles outbreak, and there was all this in Texas, and there was a hysteria over a measles outbreak. And I've written about it before, but I wrote a long post last year, a Substack. And again, my accompanying post links to all this, so it's easy to see what I'm talking about. I had measles as a kid. Everybody I knew had measles as a kid. Nobody died. I mean, measles was a mild childhood disease when I was a child, and there was no vaccine for it. And now there's hysteria when anybody gets measles. Yeah, it's like, what's wrong with that picture? And so my favorite vaccination statistic in my studies is that between 1840 in England, so in 1840 England, measles death rate were at their peak in England. And then by 1960, so 120 years later, the measles death rate in England had declined by 99.96%. I mean, that's an amazing statistic. And that happened before there was ever a measles vaccine. So the vaccines get no credit for conquering measles in England. And in fact, the United States, and again, England was first to industrialize, it had statistics going back further. But in the United States, between 1900 and 1962, which is the year before the measles vaccine was introduced in the United States, the American measles death rate declined by 98%. So vaccines had nothing to do with the decline in measles deaths in the United States. Nothing. Still nothing. I mean, they have nothing to do with it. But the dogma is that measles was this wonderful intervention that conquered vaccines. And again, big lies, big, huge lies. But everybody believes them. And so, in fact, in Suri's book was this, that was a rather amusing anecdote. So he had in his social circles, he had an acquaintance who was an MD. And this MD knew that Suri was involved in, vaccination litigation, et cetera. But they didn't talk about it. They didn't, in fact, they both knew what each was into, but they I think made some agreement not to discuss it until, I think it was maybe this outbreak that happened last year. This MD couldn't stay silent any longer, and he just blurted out, how terrible it is, and measles is back, and how these people not getting vaccinated and vaccines is what beat measles. And so Siri then spoke up and he goes, hey, the U.S. Measles death rate in the United States declined by 98% between 1900 and 1962. The year before, the measles vaccine was introduced. And then Siri asked him, so what was responsible for that decline? And the MD trumpeted vaccines. And then Siri said it again. I said, well, just listen to what I'm saying. So if the measles death rate declined by 98% between 1900 and 1962, and the measles vaccine was not introduced in 1963, how could vaccines be responsible? And the MD again trumpeted vaccines did it. And so the third time that Siri said this, it finally sank in with his doctor. So, I mean, he was just like some dog, some dancing bear or something. He was what an idiot. I mean, literally, his brain had turned off. All he could do was spout, the propaganda that he'd been imbued with. So he was incapable of thinking. Again, after a third time, he finally kind of, oh, really? Well, heck, and then I've seen this, that 2% decline since then. I've seen people try to have vaccine take the credit for that, which is also totally bogus. It's like there is no discernible change in the curve from vaccines for the decline in measles deaths at all. So again, there's no evidence that measles was conquered by vaccines at all. There's none. And so that kind of reaction, idiotic reaction by the doctor, well, I wish it was unusual, but it's not. This is how it is. Yeah, don't try to engage an MD on these subjects. All you get is like what this guy did. So all they know is what they're taught, and MDs are just fed with propaganda. They're basically the marketing and administration conduit for big pharma. Yeah, so they don't know any better. They should, but they don't. Yeah, and in fact, when I've seen MDs who finally leave the fold and start writing about this stuff, it's because they saw patients injured and killed by vaccines. In fact, so-called anti-vaxxer parents, same thing. They didn't just somehow adopt some position because they, read some tabloid or whatever it is. They saw loved ones, people around them being injured and killed by vaccines. That's what made them so-called anti-vaxxers. Yes, again, I have one of my college roommates was crippled by the COVID vaccine. The other one was probably killed by the COVID vaccine. This is normal. In fact, in Siri's book, he cited the statistic. I saw it. It was a study not too long ago where a quarter of Americans know somebody they think died from the COVID vaccine. Yeah, so this is, it's out there. Yeah, so if you're an American, there's 1 in 4 chance there's somebody that you suspect was killed by the COVID vaccine. So, back to, really Siri's book, he echoed Noam's observation about how the journalists parrot elite propaganda. Well, the medical professionals just parrot medical propaganda. Yeah, so they do the same way. And they believe in their work. So, but even when there's no objective evidence that supports that belief, they'll go on believing it and parroting just nonsense. In fact, Noam even fell under the spell of bad medical propaganda when he advocated ostracism of people who didn't get COVID vaccines. And that was I caught some grief for Noam's position on that, being Ed's biographer, etc. So, basically, the kind of the gist of Siri's book on that is the 1986 law that shielded vaccine makers from liability because vaccines were, quote, unavoidably unsafe. That was literally the language of the law. That's why they gave them the shield. Once they got that liability shield, then it removed all incentive to make vaccines safe. So anyway, so Siri's book is one long tale of, and again, with depositions, and again, it's rock solid. It's a long tale of corruption and scandal, basically orchestrated by Big Pharma. Because it's all about those profits. And so, in fact, Siri also cited a study that was led by vaccine legend Peter Abbey from Denmark. That, and again, RFK Jr.'s real Anthony Fauci also, I read about it in there years ago, where Bill Gates again, Mr. Vaccine, he had an MMR, that's measles, mumps, rubella vaccine there in Africa. Again, former colonialism, and basically there was no safety testing of it. In fact, Abbey asked, he goes, "Where's," because Gates was trying to have more campaigns and stuff, and Abbey asked, "Well, where's the safety study?" And they admitted there wasn't one. So Abbey did and his team, they did a retrospective look at that, and they found that African girls who got that vaccine, their death rate was 10 times the rate of girls who didn't get it. And these studies is like, this guy was a legend in the field, and Gates, once that study came out, Gates wrecked the careers of those scientists who showed that the vaccine emperor, was stark naked. And so yeah, so vaccines are worthless. I mean, not they're worse than worthless. They kill people. They're 10 times the death rate if you take one of those vaccines. And so this is and these are the dirty secrets of the medical racket. In fact, Siri also Japan had a huge study on measles, 100,000 people in the study, and they found that. And again, this is back to, we don't understand immunity. So it turned out that the people who had measles versus people who didn't were far healthier. They only had half the death rate from heart disease as people who didn't have measles. And so again, there's something about these mild childhood diseases that seem to train our immune systems. And immune systems, they're involved with cancer. It's not just infectious disease. So immune systems, again, have a lot to do with our overall health and keeping our bodies running well. Yeah, it's not just fighting off infectious diseases. And this is, I know that this is it's not understood well at all. It's not understood well. So it's all propaganda and bogus science that its current undergirds of current paradigm. And so anyway, this Japanese study, so Siri kept giving it to officials and stuff, and it just, nobody, again, officials try to act like these studies don't exist, and they do. So yeah, so this is something that, anyway, so Siri is one of many. I read a bunch of books on this subject, and his is the most recent I'm reading, but I've read a bunch over the years. And yeah, so the bottom line is that medical interventions are for degenerative infectious diseases, and medical interventions and preventives are worthless. In fact, worse than worthless, because they usually kill off the patients. Quite often, again, they end up killing the patients quite frequently, but they bring in trillions of dollars of revenue each year. And so this is the medical system, the Western medical system. Again, I call it a racket, call it what you will, but it's worthless. And in fact, I write about this quite a bit in my work as far as science. So actual science, I believe in the scientific process. If it's honestly, it has its limits, even if it was honestly undertaken. But when the scientific process is corrupt, yeah, it's going to come up with corrupt results. And biomedical science is legendary for this. I said even people who defend science, they don't defend biomedical science because they realize how flimsy and corrupt it all is. And what I call the fifth epoch. So again, when we live in a world of abundance, which has to be based on energy abundance, back to the free energy technology that I'm aware of, again, anti-grav, and anti-grav's a bonus in my opinion, and then the other tech I'm aware of, exotic materials, etc. It will bring a Star Trek-like future to humanity. It could happen in my lifetime if I found enough people who could learn to sing the song of abundance and do the work. Those disillusioned idealists that I seek all the time. In what I call the fifth epoch, which is that world of abundance, when scarcity and fear are permanently banished from human societies, science, there'll still be science, but it'll only have a faint resemblance to today's version of it. And this is what my friend Brian O'Leary was about, as far as science needs to lose its materialism. It needs to, if it's performed under corrupt auspices, it's going to have, again, corrupt conclusions, etc. Yeah, and so in the fifth epoch, science will only bear a faint resemblance to today's, and especially biomedical science. And in the fifth epoch, the fifth epoch that I envision, everybody will live to be 100, and they'll be healthy the entire way. Maybe 150, I don't know, but they'll be healthy, and medical interventions will be extremely unusual, almost never done. So people will live long, healthy lives with no medical interventions. And today's world will be seen as a very primitive time, very barbaric, primitive time. And male warfare-based medicine people will look at that and it'll be hard to believe. And that's what was called medicine. As we can look back at 200 years ago when it was mercury and bleedings and arsenic and this stuff was so-called medicine in the West. Yeah, so it's not that long ago. You look back and you can hardly believe it. Or the Journal of Medical Association promoting cigarettes for a generation, which only ended just before. I mean, it ended in the 50s, but it only ended because the drug companies started complaining that there's a drug ad and next to it's a cigarette ad, and cigarettes were being treated like they were wonder drugs. This isn't that long ago. So anyway, so the barbarity and the primitiveness of our medical racket, yeah, it's going to be another one for the dustbin of history, like so much that not very much of our world will survive in what I call the fifth epoch, especially Western medicine today. So, yeah, emergency rooms are good, reconstructive surgeries, but again, in fifth epoch, I don't expect people to need reconstructive surgeries or emergency rooms. This is again those days will end, and we don't need that. So anyway, this first post is more of an overview. And in future posts, I'll get into more of the nitty gritty of this stuff. And so again, these are subjects that I've studied for many years. And so we'll see when I'm not sure when I'll, finish or continue these posts, but again, it dovetails into, again, my days of study. So the medical racket was one of the early subjects that I studied back there beginning in 1990. So that's all I have for today. Bye.